Hi, and welcome to Cereal Killers, the podcast all about the pests, diseases, problems of cereal crops. And today we have a Halloween special. And today's subject is the ghost moth, or in the scientific language, Hepialis humuli. So it's called humuli because it was thought that it used to eat the roots of hop plants. And hop's scientific name is Humulus lupulus, probably the best scientific name to say. Humulus lupulus. So Linnaeus, Carl von Linn, the Swedish botanist and zoologist who came up with scientific names originally, he was the first person to describe the ghost moth. And so he believed it was eating hop roots, so he named it Hepialis humuli. Even though it's subsequently been found that it doesn't eat hop roots, it's still got that name. So scientific names don't change very often. As I said, there are beetles going around the place that are named after Adolf Hitler, and people haven't bothered to change their names because they very rarely get changed unless there's a reason that that's definitely the wrong name to give it. So a good example is if it's previously been described by somebody else, or it's not actually belonging to that plant family or that insect family. So Hepialis humuli is the ghost moth. It's related to the swift moths, is in the swift moth family, and they are very interesting moths. Now, you may not have heard of the ghost moth, but unless you're a naturalist, but it does eat cereal plants. It does eat a lot of horticultural crops as well, and it's a really interesting insect to look at because its biology is unlike a lot of the pests and diseases that we've talked about before. Okay, so its common name, the ghost moth, is named because its white colour of the adult males that are about 4 to 5 centimetres long, and they have this weird dance that they fly about in at night when they're mating, and they sort of fly in a pendulum fashion to attract the females. And they do that for a very specific reason we'll go on to. The females are not ghost-coloured, but they're sort of like a mustard colour, and they're 5 to 7 centimetres long. They're not the most disgusting-looking moths in the world. They're quite attractive if you're into moths, a mustard one and a white moth. And they're much larger, so they're 5 to 7 centimetres long. So in science, we call that sexual dimorphism, when one of the sexes is, I was going to say genders then, didn't want to get into that minefield. One of the sexes is much larger or smaller or different shaped or things like that. So some crabs have different shaped claws and things like that, depending on the sex. And ghost moths, they look completely different. Okay, so being a moth, it's related to moths and caterpillars. Moths and butterflies are Lepidoptera, and so they always have caterpillars that then form a pupa, a chrysalis or a cocoon, and then the adult, the flying adult, normally then pupates out and lays eggs. And the ghost moth is no different. It produces caterpillars. However, this is the key difference. One of the key differences is that the caterpillars of the ghost moth are white and with a reddish brown head, and they live under the ground eating plant roots. And so they're often referred to as maggots or larvae, not caterpillars, even though they, strictly speaking, are caterpillars. So you might mistake them for a grub of some other type of pest, and they can get fairly deep down in the soil. And the ghost moth caterpillar can eat a wide range of different plants. So what we term polyphagous. It's not obligate for one species of crop or plant for it to eat. So it can eat cereals. It can eat lettuce. It's a big problem in carrots, and it's especially a problem in forestry. It also eats weeds like nettles. And the reason it's a problem in forestry and not in cereals is because it takes 2 years from the egg being laid for it to pupate and then turn into an adult. So they spend 2 years underground. And as they spend 2 years underground, the damage gets significantly worse in that second year and towards the end because they're eating so much more and their population grows. Now, in a arable field, you're going to get cultivation of some sort at least after a year. And so that brings up the caterpillars, and they can be ate by their significant pests, predators like birds, badgers, foxes, parasitic wasps will attack them, moles will eat them, and especially bats. Okay, so we'll come back to that as well. So unlike the very hungry caterpillar in the kids' book that eats a sausage, a salami, a piece of cherry pie, 2 leaves, by the end, it gets very hungry and has to have a rest. It has a stomachache. This one is eating cereals, lettuce, carrots, pines, nettles, and then after 2 years, it's pupating. So it is a very hungry caterpillar if you allow it to be in your crop for 2 years. Now, I said the parasitic wasps, every insect has a parasitic wasp that will attack it. Even parasitic wasps have parasitic wasps that attack it. And even those parasitic wasps that have parasitic wasps that attack them have parasitic wasps that attack them. So they are the underappreciated biocontrol wasps. But the bats are the interesting one when it comes to the ghost moth. So on our Halloween theme, we'll continue that with bats. And that's the reason bats are important is because the ghost moth cannot hear. It is a deaf moth. And so normally a lot of moths have ultrasonic hearing to warn them of bat attacks and they can evade the bat. However, the ghost moth is deaf. So it's thought that the ghost moth and other moths after the ghost moth evolved hearing to evade bats that evolved after these moths. So these moths evolutionary predate bats. So what do they do to prevent themselves being eaten by bats? Well, that's something called lekking. So lekking is this twilight flight of the male ghost moths in this pendulum fashion, and all the males congregate together and they compete for the females. They release a pheromone to attract the females, and you might read that this pheromone is described as goat-like, almost like it smells of goats. But on the literature, it's a bit confusing because some of the literature says they smell of the goat moth. So do they smell of the goat moth or do they smell of goats? It's a bit confusing, that. So this lekking occurs at twilight, and the white, shiny ghost moths make quite an interesting display. And then that attracts the females, and especially these pheromones that attract them. And then they mate. And then the males just fall down and die after they've mated. And then the females, they go off and lay eggs, and they can lay up to 600. On average, they lay 600 eggs in 4 days, but that range can be anywhere from 200 to 1,600 eggs. So that's a lot of eggs. And that's all the resources for those eggs has come from the caterpillar feeding on the plant roots. None of that resources comes from the moth feeding on nectar or pollen of flowers, as other moths might do, because the ghost moth completely lacks any mouth parts or feeding parts in its adult phase. So it can't taste, it can't eat, it can't hear anything. So it's a good job it can smell, because that's maybe why lekking is so important, because it's one of the few senses that it can actually do. So, and after those females have laid their eggs, they go and die as well. So they don't stay in their adult phase for very long. And then those eggs lay hatch into the larvae, which can be up to 5 centimeters long. They can actually live for up to 3 years as well in some situations. And they have 12, what we call instars, or 12 molts. As I say, second year, they do most damage. Not sure how that relates to direct drilling, but there could be an issue with direct drilling and not bringing ghost moths to the service. But don't let ghost moths keep you awake at night, because they're not a major pest. So they pupate in April to May, and then they emerge June to July. So there's a fairly long pupation period where they lie dormant, or certainly not dormant, but they're metamorphosizing in their chrysalis there. Other Halloween moth-related issues, not to be confused with the ghost moth with the death's head hawk moth, which you will have seen on the film Silence the Lambs. That's the one that has sometimes it looks like it has a skull on its thorax, on its back. And in Silence the Lambs, the serial killer put it into people's throats. It's pretty grim. It's not the nicest of moths in reality either, because it invades beehives and steals honey and pollen from the beehives, and it tricks them into thinking that it's one of the bees. And it's it's an African species that migrates to the UK. So it does that species, even though it's in Silence of the Lambs, that's based in southern USA, it actually does, one of the species does occur in the UK. But luckily, the death's head hawk moth is not a serial killer. It's not a pest of arable crops. But the ghost moth is. You don't need to change your cultivation strategies or pest and disease control systems, because basically everything you do in arable systems keeps their numbers to a good minimum. It's not a vulnerable or endangered species, so you don't need to worry about that. It's just something interesting. If you're out in the fields in the evening, you may see a lekking of ghost moths, and send us a picture. If you've got one, probably quite difficult to get a good picture because it's at twilight, but it'd be very interesting to know if you've encountered any mass congregations of ghost moths on your farm or around where you live. Just going back to lekking, I forgot to say how that's linked to bat predation. And it's thought that the ghost moth congregate in these big leks and do their display and attract the females in a short period of time at twilight, so they can get their mating over and done with, sort out which ones they want to mate with really quickly before the bats can come and predate them and eat them all up. And so congregating together is a strategy that lots of animals use to reduce predation, and then making it occur so in such a short period of time means that they don't need to dodge bats. They just get away, mate, die, and then go, and the females go off and lay eggs. Thanks very much for listening. I really appreciate it. As a thank you for reaching the end of this spooky Halloween edition, I'm going to give you a treat in the spirit of Halloween. If you use the discount code GHOST in capital letters on the Udreamer website, you'll get a fantastic 13% discount for the next 2 weeks. So very much on brand for the Halloween, a 13% discount if you use the discount code GHOST, all one word. Oh, one word. It is one word. All capital letters, GHOST. You can use that on everything apart from blackgrass spores, which have a set price. But everything else, all the other biostimulants, fertilizers, biopesticides, please use that code. And if you like the podcast, give it a like, subscribe, hit the bell icon if you want to be notified of when we've got new episodes. And hopefully we'll have a new episode soon, and probably put a little treat at the end of every podcast now to thank everyone who's took the time to listen to probably 10 to 30 minutes of my absolute drivel. Thank you very much.